For most of my life, I was being watched. Not by anyone else. By myself. There was always an internal presence just behind my thoughts. Observing, evaluating, correcting. A quiet authority that never raised its voice because it didn't need to. It simply noticed. Are you doing enough? Is this the right use of time? Shouldn't you feel more grateful? Is this who you want to be? The questions were endless and normal. I didn't consider this voice a problem. I considered it maturity, responsibility, self-awareness. Only later did I realize how exhausting it was to live under constant supervision. Even in moments of rest, I was being assessed. Was I resting correctly? Was I enjoying myself enough? Was this rest earned? Joy rarely arrived uninspected. Before it could settle, it was measured, compared, framed. Was this joy productive? Was it distracting? Was it deserved? I thought this was conscience. It wasn't. It was management. The internal supervisor didn't want me to suffer. It wanted me to optimize, to refine, to align, to become a better version of myself. Endlessly, I noticed how deeply this supervision shaped my behavior. I chose activities not because I wanted them, but because they would look reasonable in retrospect. I avoided rest that couldn't be justified. I avoided pleasure that felt too spontaneous. I lived as if my life would be audited later, as if every moment would need an explanation. This supervisor wasn't cruel. That's what made it powerful. It spoke in calm logic, in improvement language, in concern. You're just holding yourself accountable, it would say. Without standards, you'll drift. Without reflection, you'll waste your life. I believed it. For years. Even when I let go of meaning. Even when I stopped chasing identity. Even when I learned to stay present. The supervisor remained, watching presence itself. Am I present enough? Am I doing presence right? Is this authentic or lazy? I realized then that I had replaced old goals with new ones. Instead of achievement, I was optimizing awareness. Instead of success, I was managing alignment. The structure remained. Only the content changed. That realization unsettled me because it meant I had never truly rested. I had only changed the criteria. One afternoon, doing absolutely nothing, I noticed the tension. Not physical, subtle, a readiness, as if I were about to be evaluated at any moment. Even alone, even unseen, I asked myself a dangerous question. What would happen if no one, not even me, was watching? The question felt irresponsible, almost immoral. Without oversight, wouldn't I collapse into indulgence? Wouldn't I become careless? Wouldn't I lose discipline? These fears were familiar. They were the supervisor's final argument. I didn't try to answer immediately. I let the question linger. And slowly, something revealed itself. The supervisor wasn't protecting my values. It was confusing control with care. I began to notice moments when I acted naturally, without commentary, laughing unexpectedly, resting deeply, speaking without rehearsal. They felt clean, unburdened. In those moments, nothing collapsed. I didn't become reckless. I didn't lose integrity. I simply existed without monitoring. That discovery changed the tone of my days. Not instantly, gradually. I experimented with allowing actions to pass without review, finishing a walk without evaluating its benefit, ending a conversation without replaying it, resting without justification. The supervisor protested quietly. This isn't efficient, that you're letting things slide, that you're losing structure. But something else spoke too. Not loudly, not verbally, a sense of ease. I realized how much energy had been consumed by self-surveillance, by constant correction, by anticipation of regret. Without it, days felt lighter, not easier, lighter. I began to understand that awareness doesn't require supervision. Presence doesn't need policing. Integrity doesn't need commentary. This was not about abandoning responsibility. It was about changing its location, from constant monitoring to responsiveness. Instead of asking, "Am I doing this right?" I asked, "Do I need to respond to something right now?" Often, the answer was no. I noticed how often the supervisor had spoken in advance, preventing imagined mistakes. avoiding hypothetical regret. Without it, life became more immediate, less defensive. There were moments of discomfort, uncertainty, unstructured time. But discomfort wasn't failure. It was unfamiliar freedom. I realized that the supervisor thrived on distance, watching life from above, evaluating patterns, projecting outcomes. Living without it meant entering life directly, without abstraction, without safety rails. This felt risky, but also felt honest. I stopped pre-approving my actions, stopped preparing explanations, stopped living as if I owed coherence to a future observer. That observer had been me, and I let them go. Not violently, not rebelliously, gently. I didn't silence the supervisor. I stopped listening. It still appeared sometimes. Out of habit, out of concern. I acknowledged it and continued. I wasn't becoming careless. I was becoming responsive. There's a difference. This phase didn't feel like liberation. It felt like unburdening, like setting down something I'd been carrying so long I forgot it was optional. I understood then that self-trust is not confidence. It's absence of supervision. I didn't need to monitor myself to live responsibly. I needed to be available. Available to fatigue. Available to curiosity. Available to discomfort. Available to desire, without turning it into a problem. I sensed that this was only the beginning. Letting go of the supervisor revealed something deeper, a more subtle layer of fear, the fear of not being in control, even of myself. That fear hadn't spoken yet, but I could feel it waiting. The silence that followed the supervisor's fading was not peaceful at first. It was unfamiliar. Without the constant internal evaluation, my thoughts moved differently, slower sometimes, messier at other times. There was no longer an immediate correction after every impulse, every idea, every emotion. For the first time, I noticed how much of my behavior had been shaped by anticipation, not reality. Without anticipation, life felt closer. Too close sometimes. I noticed the first wave of fear during a simple moment. I had an entire afternoon with nothing scheduled. No deadlines. No expectations. No visible obligations. Previously, this kind of time would instantly trigger planning, optimization, or preparation for future productivity. This time, I didn't do that. I simply sat with the open space. And then it arrived. A quiet but unmistakable fear. If no one is directing you, what prevents you from drifting? If you're not controlling yourself, who guarantees you won't lose direction completely? The fear didn't sound dramatic. It sounded practical, reasonable, responsible. It felt like wisdom disguised as anxiety. For years, control had been my insurance policy, not just against failure, against unpredictability. Control created the illusion that I could prevent regret before it happened, that if I examined every choice carefully enough, life would remain coherent, safe, and understandable. Letting go of supervision meant letting go of that illusion. The realization surfaced gradually. I wasn't afraid of making mistakes. I was afraid of not being able to predict myself. That fear was deeper than perfectionism. It was existential. If I'm not constantly monitoring who I am becoming, then who am I becoming? This question had no stable answer. And for the first time, I didn't rush to create one. Instead, I observed how discomfort moved through my body. It wasn't panic. It was tension without direction, a feeling of standing without leaning on anything. Previously, the supervisor acted like a structure I leaned against. Without it, I was standing freely, which felt unstable simply because I wasn't used to it. I noticed something unexpected. The fear appeared strongest during stillness, not during action. When I was engaged in conversation, movement, or creation, I rarely thought about control. Life unfolded naturally. Decisions happened organically. Responses appeared without management. But when I stopped, the mind attempted to rebuild its control tower. You should plan something. You should define a goal. You should make sure you're moving forward. The urgency felt familiar. But now, instead of automatically obeying it, I watched it. The fear behind it revealed itself slowly. It wasn't fear of wasting time. It was fear of becoming invisible, even to myself. The supervisor had served as a witness, a narrator that confirmed I existed through observation and interpretation. Without it, life unfolded without commentary, without documentation, without internal applause or internal criticism, just happening. That felt strangely anonymous. For a while, I thought something was missing, a sense of continuity, a story that connected moments into a recognizable identity. Without supervision, life felt more like separate experiences instead of a single narrative. At first, I interpreted this as loss. Later, I recognized it as freedom from performance. I began to notice how identity had often been constructed through reflection after action. I would do something, then explain it to myself, analyze it, label it, and place it into a coherent storyline about who I was becoming. Without that process, actions remained actions. Not symbols, not statements, just expressions. This was deeply unsettling and deeply peaceful. I also noticed another layer of fear. Without control, how do you know you're growing? Growth had always been measured, evaluated, compared. Improvement required criteria, benchmarks, evidence of progress. Now, growth felt organic and invisible. There were no clear milestones, no confirmation. I worried that without measurement, I might stagnate, that without intentional direction, I might simply repeat comfortable patterns without noticing. But something unexpected began to happen. I started noticing changes that had never appeared during structured self-improvement. Small, quiet shifts. I reacted more gently during disagreements. I rested without internal negotiation. I spoke more honestly without rehearsing outcomes. I allowed uncertainty without immediately resolving it. None of these changes were planned. None were tracked. Yet they were real. This confused the part of me that believed growth must be engineered. I started to suspect something radical. What if growth happens most naturally when it is not supervised? The idea felt almost dangerous. It challenged everything I had been taught about discipline, self-development, and responsibility. For several weeks, I lived in a strange middle space, not returning to full control, not fully trusting its absence. Some days, I instinctively reached for the old supervisor, especially during stress, conflict, or uncertainty. It felt safe, familiar, efficient. Other days, I allowed life to move without internal management, and those days felt slower but deeper. I noticed the difference in texture. Control created sharpness, clarity, and predictability. Trust created softness, fluidity, and surprise. Neither felt entirely comfortable, but only one felt alive. The turning point arrived during an ordinary mistake. I forgot an important commitment, something that, in the past, would have triggered hours of internal criticism and self-correction. The supervisor immediately reappeared. You should have planned better. You're becoming careless. This is exactly what happens when you stop monitoring yourself. The old reflex was strong. I almost accepted the accusation automatically. But then something unusual happened. Instead of defending myself or correcting myself, I simply handled the situation externally. I apologized. I adjusted. I responded to the consequences directly. And then I stopped. I didn't continue the internal punishment. I didn't create a self-improvement strategy. I didn't analyze what this mistake meant about my character. The moment ended when the situation ended. Nothing followed it. That absence felt shocking. For years, mistakes had created extended internal trials, entire psychological investigations, character evaluations, long-term identity revisions. Now, the mistake existed only as an event, not a verdict. I realized then that control had not prevented mistakes. It had extended them. Without internal supervision, mistakes still happened, but they ended faster. They remained specific instead of becoming global conclusions about who I was. This changed my understanding of responsibility completely. Responsibility was not constant monitoring. Responsibility was responsiveness in real time. The difference was subtle but transformative. Monitoring attempts to prevent imperfection. Responsiveness adapts to reality. I began trusting that life itself provides feedback through consequences, through relationships, through emotional signals, through physical exhaustion or inspiration. These feedback systems operated naturally, without constant internal narration. The more I trusted this, the quieter the fear became. Not because I eliminated uncertainty, because I stopped trying to dominate it. I started to understand that control is often an attempt to replace relationship with life. Instead of interacting with reality, control tries to predict and organize it from a distance. Living without the supervisor meant staying inside the relationship. Inside unpredictability. Inside immediacy. There was still fear, but it no longer felt like a warning. It felt like the sensation of stepping onto open ground after leaving a narrow path. And slowly, I noticed something else emerging beneath the fear. Not confidence, not certainty, something quieter. Trust that did not come from knowing what would happen. Trust that came from knowing I could meet what happens. That trust didn't need supervision. It needed presence. By the end of this phase, I understood that losing control of myself was never the real danger. The real danger had been never discovering who I am without control. And for the first time, that discovery felt possible. The final stage of losing the supervisor did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, through ordinary days that no longer felt ordinary. At first, I kept expecting the supervisor to return fully. I believed that control was something permanent, something built too deeply into the structure of my mind to disappear entirely. Every moment of calm felt temporary, as if discipline and self-surveillance were simply resting before reclaiming authority. But they didn't return the way I expected. They changed form. Instead of commanding, they began appearing as optional suggestions. Instead of dominating my decisions, they offered perspectives. And the difference between command and suggestion turned out to be enormous. For most of my life, control spoke with urgency. It demanded immediate obedience. It presented itself as necessary for survival, success, and identity. Now its voice had softened. It spoke like a consultant rather than a ruler. And I was free to listen or not. This freedom created a new kind of responsibility that felt unfamiliar at first. Without automatic rules, every choice required awareness. Not pressure, awareness. I could no longer rely on internal systems to decide how I should behave, what I should pursue, or who I should become. Instead, I had to sense what felt honest in each moment. That kind of honesty is surprisingly difficult. Rules are easier. Structures are easier. Identities are easier. Honesty requires presence, and presence cannot be automated. I began noticing how many of my past goals had been constructed from fear rather than curiosity. I had pursued improvement because I feared stagnation. I had built routines because I feared chaos. I had maintained certain identities because I feared losing recognition, respect, or belonging. Without the supervisor constantly reinforcing these motivations, many of my ambitions started dissolving, not disappearing, transforming. Some goals remained, but they felt lighter. They no longer defined my worth. They simply reflected interests, passions, or practical directions. Other goals faded entirely, and their disappearance created space I didn't know I needed. The space was uncomfortable at first. It felt empty, like removing furniture from a familiar room. I kept expecting something urgent to replace it, something that would justify the absence. But nothing rushed in, and slowly I realized that emptiness was not a void. It was potential without demand. In this open space, I started rediscovering experiences I had long ignored. Small pleasures returned with surprising intensity. Walking without destination, listening to music without analyzing lyrics, speaking with people without rehearsing responses. Life began feeling less like a project and more like a conversation. The most surprising transformation happened in how I experienced time. Under supervision, time always felt scarce. Every moment was evaluated based on productivity, growth, or preparation for the future. Even rest carried hidden guilt because it did not produce measurable outcomes. Without constant monitoring, time expanded, not objectively, subjectively. Moments lasted longer because I was fully inside them instead of measuring them against future expectations. I noticed textures, sounds, emotional nuances, and physical sensations that had previously gone unnoticed. This deeper attention created a sense of richness that no achievement had ever provided. However, this shift also introduced a new fear. If life becomes valuable in ordinary moments, what happens to ambition? What happens to striving? What happens to progress? For a while, I worried that losing internal pressure would make me passive or directionless. Society often teaches that discomfort drives success, that constant self-improvement is the only path to meaningful achievement. But I started observing something different. When action emerged from curiosity or genuine interest instead of fear or obligation, it became more sustainable. I worked longer without exhaustion. I focused more deeply without forcing concentration. I created with more originality because I was not trying to meet predefined standards. Effort remained, but struggle changed form. Instead of pushing against myself, I began moving with myself. Resistance still appeared, but it became information rather than an enemy. If something felt consistently forced, I explored why. Sometimes it meant I needed rest. Sometimes it meant I needed a different approach. Sometimes it meant the goal itself was not aligned with who I was becoming. This alignment created a quiet sense of stability. Not stability based on routine. Stability based on internal coherence. For the first time, I felt that my actions, emotions, and thoughts were moving in the same direction without negotiation. Decisions required less internal debate. Choices felt simpler, even when they were difficult. Relationships also changed. Without constant self-monitoring, I became less focused on how I was perceived. Conversations felt more direct, more authentic, sometimes more vulnerable. I allowed silence without rushing to fill it. I admitted uncertainty without feeling inadequate. Interestingly, this openness created deeper trust with others. People responded to authenticity more strongly than they had ever responded to my carefully constructed competence. I realized that control had often been a performance of stability rather than true stability. True stability came from accepting unpredictability instead of trying to eliminate it. The final disappearance of the supervisor happened during a moment so simple that I almost missed it. I was sitting outside, watching clouds move slowly across the sky. There was no significant event, no crisis, no decision to make. Just movement and observation. Suddenly, I noticed that nothing inside me was evaluating the moment. No analysis of productivity. No concern about wasted time. No attempt to transform the experience into insight or growth. I was simply there. The absence of commentary felt so natural that it startled me. For a brief moment, I searched for the supervisor, expecting it to reappear and explain what this experience meant. But there was nothing, only presence. In that stillness, I understood something that had been impossible to grasp intellectually. Identity does not require constant observation to exist. Meaning does not require constant interpretation to be real. Life does not require constant control to remain coherent. These realizations did not arrive as thoughts. They arrived as silence that felt complete. I also understood that losing the supervisor was not about rejecting discipline or awareness. It was about changing their source. Instead of discipline imposed by fear, I discovered discipline emerging from care. Instead of awareness driven by self-criticism, I discovered awareness driven by curiosity. The difference transformed everything. Care is sustainable. Fear is exhausting. Curiosity expands. Judgment contracts. As days passed, I noticed that the mind still occasionally attempted to rebuild old patterns of control, especially during stress or uncertainty. But these attempts no longer felt authoritative. They felt like habits fading through lack of reinforcement. I acknowledged them without resistance, and they passed naturally. What replaced them was not a new system or philosophy. It was something much simpler. Trust. Not blind trust. Not naive optimism. Trust built from repeated experiences of meeting life without collapsing. Trust built from discovering that uncertainty does not destroy identity. It reveals flexibility. Trust built from realizing that growth continues even when it is not measured or supervised. This trust created a quiet confidence that did not need validation. It did not depend on achievement, control, or external recognition. It existed independently, like a steady background rhythm beneath changing circumstances. Looking back, I understood that the supervisor had never been an enemy. It had been a protective structure created during times when uncertainty felt dangerous. It had helped me build stability when I needed it most. But eventually, protection can become limitation. And maturity sometimes means thanking old structures and allowing them to dissolve. Now, life felt less predictable but more honest. Less controlled but more coherent. Less defined but more meaningful. I no longer felt like the manager of my existence. I felt like a participant. And participation, I realized, requires something far more courageous than control. It requires willingness to experience life without guarantees. Standing in that realization, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. Not relief from responsibility. Relief from the belief that I must constantly supervise my right to exist. For the first time, being alive felt sufficient. And in that sufficiency, something new began. Not a new identity, not a final understanding, just an open continuation. Because life, without supervision, is not a completed story. It is a conversation that never stops evolving.